Good evening. Tonight we begin with something a little unexpected for a bedtime tale. The entire history of Henbane, a poisonous, powerful plant that bridged the gap between divine madness and demonic witchcraft, shaping 6,000 years of human civilization. Forget the fantasy novels and Halloween decorations. The real story didn't start with pointed hats and broomsticks or medieval superstition. It began at ancient oracles, on Viking battlefields, in monastic hospitals, and the trembling hands of healers walking the razor's edge between remedy and death. The truth is, dropped into a Greek temple or a medieval surgery, you'd learn fast that consciousness-altering plants weren't recreational curiosities. They were gateways to the divine, tools of war, and the only relief from unbearable pain. And Henbane, with its bell-shaped flowers and fetid leaves, often proved to be the thin, dangerous margin between healing and oblivion. Before you get too comfortable, give the video a like and subscribe if you're enjoying it. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is on your end. It's incredible to see viewers joining in from every corner of the world. Silence your notifications. Take a deep breath, and let's begin. The year is 1500 before the Common Era. Somewhere in the Nile Delta, a physician kneels beside a patient writhing in pain. The heat is oppressive. Flies circle. There are no modern drugs, no syringes, no understanding of germs or inflammation or nerve endings. Just plants. Just trial and error passed down through generations. The physician reaches for a preparation made from a plant the Egyptians call by a name we can barely pronounce today. The recipe is written on papyrus, inked carefully by scribes who learned it from their predecessors. This document, the Ebers Papyrus, is one of the oldest medical texts in existence, and buried within its columns of hieratic script is a reference to Henbane. We don't know if the patient lived. We don't know if the dose was right or if the physician's hands trembled as he administered it. But we know this. Henbane was already ancient by the time someone bothered to write down. For thousands of years before that papyrus was created, humans have been using this plant, testing it, watching people die from it, watching others find relief. The knowledge wasn't passed through universities or peer-reviewed journals. It was whispered from healer to apprentice, refined through tragedy, preserved through memory. By the time the Greeks rose to prominence, Henbane had spread across the Mediterranean like a shadow. The plant grew wild along roadsides and in waste places, its sticky, foul-smelling leaves covered in glandular hairs that left a residue on anyone who touched them. The flowers were pale yellow with purple veins, almost beautiful if you could get past the stench. But it wasn't the appearance that mattered. It was what happened when you consumed it. The Greeks called it Hyoscyamus. They understood, perhaps better than anyone before them, that the line between medicine and poison was not a moral distinction. It was a mathematical one, a matter of dose. A talented physician could use Henbane to ease unbearable pain, to calm a violent madness, to allow a patient to sleep through agony. A careless one could kill. And between those two outcomes lay a margin so thin it required years of training to navigate. Dioscorides was one of those physicians. A Greek doctor serving in the Roman army during the 1st century of the Common Era, he traveled across the empire, observing plants, testing remedies, documenting everything. His work, known as De Materia Medica, would become the foundation of pharmacology for over 1,500 years. And in it, he wrote about Henbane with the careful precision of someone who had seen both its benefits and its horrors. He recommended it as a sedative, as an analgesic, as a way to grant desperate patients a few hours of peace. But he also warned about the dangers. The sleep it brought was not natural. It was heavy, dreamlike, touched with visions that blurred the line between waking and unconsciousness. Around the same time, Pliny the Elder was compiling his own massive encyclopedia of natural history. Pliny was not a physician. He was a scholar, an administrator, a man who collected information the way some people collect coins. And when he wrote about Henbane, his tone was different from Dioscorides. More cautious, more disturbed. He described it as having the nature of wine, offensive to understanding. It made people act strangely. It clouded judgment. It turned rational men into babbling fools. He was fascinated and repelled in equal measure. But for the Greeks, that clouding of judgment was not always a problem. Sometimes it was the point. At Delphi, on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, stood one of the most important religious sites in the ancient world. People traveled for weeks to reach it, bringing questions about war, marriage, harvest, fate. And waiting for them at the center of the temple was the Pythia, the high priestess of Apollo, the woman who could supposedly speak with the voice of a god. She would sit on a tripod over a crack in the earth, breathing vapors that rose from below and enter a trance. When she spoke, her words were cryptic, fragmented, delivered in a voice that witnesses described as not quite her own. Priests would interpret the pronouncements, shaping them into prophecies that kings and generals used to make decisions that changed history. For centuries, scholars assumed the vapors were geological, gases seeping from a fissure. But another theory has gained traction in recent decades. What if the Pythia was inhaling smoke from burning henbane? The plant was sacred to Apollo. It grew in the region, and its effects, rapid onset of dissociation, visual distortions, a sense of losing control of one's own voice, matched the descriptions of what happened to the priestess. We may never know for certain. The rituals were secret. The methods died with the priests who practiced them. But the possibility remains, hanging in the air like incense smoke, that one of the most influential institutions in the ancient world was powered by a plant that could kill you if you got the dose wrong. The Romans inherited Greek medicine wholesale. They refined it, systematized it, spread it across an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. Roman military doctors carried henbane with them on campaigns, using it to treat wounded soldiers who would otherwise die screaming. They learned to mix it with opium, creating combinations that were more effective than either plant alone. One Byzantine physician even wrote about grinding henbane and opium into a paste, smearing on the skin of a particular species of fish, then applying that fish to a patient's ear to treat inflammation. The logic was convoluted. The chemistry was accidental. But somehow, it worked often enough to be written down and repeated. Roman surgeons performing amputations or removing arrowheads would give patients preparations of henbane before operating. The patient would drift into a strange half-sleep, still conscious but detached, pain signals blunted but not eliminated. It was not perfect. Nothing was perfect in ancient surgery, but it was better than nothing. And for a soldier lying on a blood-soaked table while a surgeon sawed through bone, better than nothing was a miracle. Yet even as Roman doctors used henbane to save lives, they knew they were handling something dangerous. The plant's active compounds, chemicals we now call hyoscyamus, atropine, and scopolamine, interfere with the nervous system in ways that can spiral out of control. At low doses, they cause dry mouth, blurred vision, a slight quickening of the heart. At higher doses, hallucinations, delirium, violent agitation. Higher still, seizures, coma, death. There is no antidote, no way to reverse the process once it's begun. You can only wait and hope the patient's body metabolizes the poison faster than it destroys them. Imagine being the physician making that calculation. Imagine holding a preparation in your hands, knowing it contains 34 different alkaloids and concentrations that vary depending on where the plant grew, what time of year it was harvested, how it was dried. Imagine looking into the eyes of someone in unbearable pain and deciding whether the risk is worth it. That was the reality for every doctor who used henbane, every single time, and yet they kept using it, because the alternative was worse. By the end of the 5th century, as the Western Roman Empire collapsed and Europe descended into chaos, henbane's reputation was already splitting in two. In the hands of trained physicians, it remained a legitimate medicine, respected and feared in equal measure. But outside those hands, in the world of folk healers and wandering wise women and people desperate enough to try anything, it was becoming something else, something harder to control. The knowledge was spreading, fragmenting, mutating as it passed from person to person. And in the centuries to come, that split would widen into a chasm. On one side, medicine. On the other, witchcraft. But that transformation was still centuries away. For now, in the twilight of the ancient world, Henbane remained what it had always been, a plant that could heal or kill depending on who held it and what they knew. The question was whether that knowledge would survive what was coming next. Chapter 2. Northern Expansion and the Viking Connection. 500 to 1100 of the Common Era. The Roman Empire is dying. Not quickly, not cleanly, but in a slow hemorrhage of territory and authority that will reshape the entire European continent. Libraries burn. Trade routes collapse. Knowledge that took centuries to accumulate vanishes in a single generation as cities are sacked and scholars flee or fall silent. But plants don't care about political boundaries. Henbane keeps growing where it always has, along roadsides and in disturbed soil, its seeds carried north by birds and travelers and the boots of migrating tribes. The question is whether anyone still remembers what to do with it. In some places, the knowledge survives. Monasteries scattered across the former empire become repositories of medical texts, copied laboriously by monks who may or may not understand what they're transcribing. But beyond the monastery walls, in villages and forests where Latin is a foreign tongue and Roman authority is just a fading memory, Henbane is being rediscovered. Not from books, from experimentation, from watching animals, from desperate people willing to try anything. And slowly, carefully, new traditions are being built from the fragments of the old. The Celts and Germanic tribes moving into former Roman lands already have their own plant knowledge, their own healers, their own rituals. When they encounter Henbane, either growing wild or cultivated near abandoned Roman settlements, they recognize something powerful. The Druids, the priestly class of Celtic society, adopted into their practices with an enthusiasm that would have made Greek priestesses nod in recognition. They use it in divination ceremonies, burning it as incense, inhaling the smoke to enter trance states where they claim to communicate with spirits and see glimpses of the future. Whether they actually see the future or just hallucinate it is beside the point. What matters is that their communities believe them. And belief, in the absence of any other framework for understanding the world, becomes its own kind of truth. Further north, in Scandinavia, Henbane is spreading through communities that will eventually become the Vikings. The plant grows well in the cool climate. It thrives in the kind of disturbed, nitrogen-rich soil you find around human settlements. And at some point, probably through the same trial and error that taught every culture how to use it, Norse healers learn its properties. They learn the doses. They learn what it can do. Now we need to talk about the berserkers. Because for over a century, popular imagination has linked these legendary Viking warriors to psychedelic mushrooms, specifically a red-capped fungus called fly agaric. The theory is appealing. It sounds right. Berserkers were described as fighting in an animalistic fury, immune to pain, unable to distinguish friend from enemy in the chaos of battle. Surely they must have been on something. And fly agaric grows throughout Scandinavia, has psychoactive properties, and was known to Norse cultures. Case closed. Except the symptoms don't match. Not really. Fly agaric causes drowsiness, muscle spasms, numbness in the extremities. It would make you a terrible warrior. If anything, you'd be more likely to fall over than charge in a battle. The Viking Museum in Stockholm explicitly states that fly agaric would have made berserkers particularly worthless fighters. So if not mushrooms, then what? In 1977, archaeologists excavating a Viking grave near Furket in Denmark found something unusual. The burial was of a woman, likely a vulva, a type of Norse shamanic practitioner who served as healer, seer, and ritual specialist. Among her grave goods, carefully placed items meant to accompany her into the afterlife, was a small pouch. Inside were over 100 seeds of black henbane, not a few seeds that might have gotten there by accident. Over 100. Deliberately collected. Intentionally preserved. Important enough to bury with the dead. This discovery sat in academic literature for decades without causing much stir. Just another data point in the vast catalog of Viking burial practices. But in 2019, an ethnobotanist named Karstenfader at the University of Ljubljana decided to take a systematic look at the berserker question. He compiled every description of berserker behavior from Norse sagas and historical accounts. Then he compared those symptoms to the known effects of various psychoactive plants available in Scandinavia during the Viking Age. Most plants could be ruled out immediately. They didn't grow in the region, or they produced the wrong kinds of effects, or there was no archaeological evidence for their use. Only one plant kept showing up in the archaeological record and matched the symptom profile: Henbane. Let's walk through what a berserker experience supposedly looked like. First came the physical onset: chills, trembling, teeth chattering. The warrior's face would swell and redden. Then the psychological shift: a rising tide of rage that obliterated normal judgment and self-preservation instincts. Berserkers were described as being as strong as bears or bulls, killing with single blows, walking through fire without apparent harm. They howled. They bit their shields. They attacked with such ferocity that even their allies kept distance. And when the battle ended, when the fury finally burned out, they collapsed into profound exhaustion that could last for days. Weakness, apathy. Sometimes they couldn't remember what they'd done. Now compare that to Henbane intoxication. The physical symptoms match almost perfectly. Henbane causes rapid changes in skin color and swelling. It produces feelings of dissociation and aggression that can range from mild agitation to full combative rage, depending on dose and individual response. It's an effective painkiller, which would explain the apparent invulnerability. Warriors who couldn't feel wounds would keep fighting through injuries that should have stopped them. And critically, Henbane causes prosopagnosia, the inability to recognize faces. If you can't recognize faces, you can't tell your brother from your enemy. You just see threats everywhere, which explains one of the most terrifying aspects of berserker accounts, that they sometimes killed their own comrades in the confusion of battle. The aftermath symptoms match too. Henbane produces severe headaches and blurred vision that persist long after the initial effects fade. Flyaggart doesn't. This is not a minor detail. If berserkers were consistently experiencing multi-day hangovers with specific neurological symptoms, that points directly to anticholinergic poisoning, which is exactly what Henbane causes. We'll never have definitive proof. The berserkers themselves kept their method secret. That was part of their mystique, part of what made them valuable. A warrior band that could enter a supernatural battle fury was worth more than ordinary fighters. And if the secret got out, if everyone could become a berserker, the advantage disappeared. So they guarded their knowledge carefully, passing it only to initiates, taking it to their graves. But the evidence we do have, archaeological, pharmacological, and historical, points in one direction. If berserkers used a drug to achieve their battle state, that drug was most likely Henbane. Imagine being a young Norse warrior preparing for your first raid. You've heard stories about the berserkers. You've seen them in battle, or heard your father describe them. These men who seem to transcend human limitations. And now you're being offered a chance to join their ranks. Someone hands you a preparation. Maybe it's a tea brewed from Henbane seeds. Maybe it's an ointment to rub on your skin where it will absorb quickly through thin tissue. Maybe it's something to smoke. We don't know the delivery method. But you take it and you wait. The first thing you feel is cold. Not the external cold of a Nordic winter, but something internal, a chill that makes your teeth chatter no matter how many furs you're wearing. Your companions are experiencing the same thing. Then comes the heat. Your face flushes. You can feel your pulse in your temples. The world starts to look different. Edges sharpen. Sounds become threatening. And rising from somewhere deep in your chest comes anger. Not anger at anything specific, just rage. Pure and wordless and overwhelming. The men around you aren't comrades anymore. They're shapes, threats, obstacles. And beyond them is the enemy. And you need to reach them, need to hurt them, need to make them stop existing. You grab your weapons and charge. Pain doesn't register. Fear doesn't exist. There's only movement and violence and the animal satisfaction of destroying what's in front of you. Hours pass in what feels like minutes. And then, slowly, the fury drains away. You're standing in a field you don't recognize, covered in blood you're not sure is yours, surrounded by bodies. Your hands won't stop shaking. Your head feels like it's splitting open. And over the next few days, the real price becomes clear. Crushing exhaustion, vision problems, an emotional numbness that makes you wonder if you're still human. That's the berserker trade-off. Supernatural effectiveness in combat, purchased with a controlled overdose of a plant that could easily kill you if someone made a mistake with the dose. No wonder they became outlawed. In 1015, Jarl Eirik Hakanarsson of Norway officially banned berserkers. The medieval Icelandic law code Gragas sentenced them to outlawry. By the 12th century, organized berserker warbands had disappeared from Scandinavian society. Too dangerous, too unpredictable, too high a cost for the communities that had to live with them during peacetime. But Henbane's role in Viking culture wasn't limited to warfare. The plant shows up in far more mundane contexts throughout Norse society. It was used in brewing. Before hops became the standard bittering and preserving agent in beer, Norse brewers used a mixture of herbs called grut, and Henbane was often part of that blend. The resulting beer was reportedly more intoxicating than it should have been based on alcohol content alone, and it had the unusual property of making people thirstier the more they drank. Good for business, terrible for judgment. Evidence of Henbane beer has been found at archaeological sites across northern Europe, including possible traces at Neolithic settlements in Scotland, suggesting the practice might be far older than the Viking Age. There's also a curious Danish tradition, recorded by archaeologists, of using henbane to stun chickens before stealing them. The plant's ability to cause temporary stupor in birds made it useful for thieves who wanted to avoid squawking that would wake the owners. This brings us back to the plant's name, henbane, bane of hens. The etymology is disputed, with some scholars arguing it refers to the plant's toxicity to chickens, others suggesting it comes from words meaning death or vision. But the chicken stunning tradition suggests at least some folk memory of the plant's effects on birds. By the time we reach 1100, henbane has become thoroughly embedded in Northern European culture. It's medicine and ritual drug, and brewing ingredient and agricultural poison. Everyone who lives in close contact with the plant knows what it can do, even if they don't understand the chemistry behind it. That knowledge is about to become extremely dangerous. Because in the coming centuries, as Christianity tightens its grip on Europe and authorities become increasingly paranoid about heresy and devil worship, anyone with too much knowledge about consciousness-altering plants will find themselves facing accusations they can't defend against. The age of the witch hunts is approaching, and henbane is about to become Exhibit A in thousands of trials that will end in torture and execution. Chapter 3. The Medieval Medical Tradition. 1000 to 1400 of the Common Era. The knowledge doesn't disappear. That's the important thing to understand as we move into the High Middle Ages. Despite everything you've heard about the Dark Ages, despite the collapse of centralized authority and the fragmentation of learning, medical knowledge survives. It survives in monasteries where monks copy ancient texts they can barely read. It survives in the memories of village healers who learn from their mothers and grandmothers. It survives in the hands of Jewish and Arab physicians working in Spain and North Africa, preserving Greek and Roman medical texts that Christian Europe has lost or forgotten. And it survives in the continued, careful use of plants like henbane by people who understand that the line between healing and killing is measured in milligrams. By the year 1000, Europe is beginning to stabilize. Trade routes are reopening. Cities are growing. And with urban density comes disease and injury on a scale that requires organized medical responses. Monasteries, which have been serving as informal hospitals for centuries, begin to formalize their practices. They create dedicated infirmaries. They train specific monks in medical skills. They compile herbals, detailed manuscripts describing medicinal plants, their properties, and their uses. And in nearly every major herbal produced during this period, you'll find henbane. The plant appears in Anglo-Saxon medical texts from the 11th century under the name Herbal. Old English glossaries list it as caniculata, Casilago, Deus Caballinus. The multiplicity of names tells you something important. This isn't obscure knowledge confined to specialists. This is a plant that ordinary people encounter regularly, that has accumulated local names in different regions, that matters enough to require precise terminology. By 1265, the modern English name Henbane has emerged, derived from the Old English words for hen and bane, meaning death. Whether this refers to the plant's toxicity to chickens or to an older association with death and visions is still debated. Both interpretations are probably true. Medieval physicians inherit their understanding of henbane directly from classical sources. They read Dioscorides in Latin translation. They study Pliny. They absorb the accumulated wisdom of 1,500 years of medical practice. But they're not just copying. They're experimenting, testing, refining. Because unlike modern doctors who can prescribe standardized pharmaceuticals with predictable concentrations, medieval physicians have to work with raw plant material that varies wildly in potency depending on growing conditions, harvest timing, and storage methods. Every batch is different. Every patient responds differently. The only way to learn is through careful observation over years of practice. One of the most sophisticated medieval uses of henbane appears in a medical text called the Antidotarium Nicolai, compiled in the 12th century at the medical school of Salerno in Italy. Salerno is important. It's one of the first institutions in medieval Europe to formalize medical education, to create a curriculum, to train physicians according to standardized methods. And one of their most valued formulations is called the Great Rest. It's a sedative used for surgery and for patients in unbearable pain. The recipe combines 3 plants: opium poppy, mandrake, and henbane. Each ingredient has narcotic properties on its own. Together, they create something more powerful than any single component. What's remarkable is that modern pharmacological analysis, conducted in 2014 by researchers at the University of Toronto, has shown that the Great Rest was actually brilliantly designed. The combination of henbane with opium doesn't just add their effects together. It creates a synergistic interaction that enhances pain relief while potentially reducing the risk of opiate addiction. How? Henbane causes rapid dissociation, a sense of detachment from your own body that kicks in within 20 minutes of administration. This dissociative effect makes repeated self-administration unlikely because the experience is profoundly unpleasant even as it relieves pain. You get the analgesic benefit of the opium without the euphoric high that drives addiction. Medieval physicians discovered this through trial and error over generations. They didn't understand the neuropharmacology. They didn't know about mu-opioid receptors or anticholinergic mechanisms. They just knew it worked, and they knew the ratios that made it safe. Safe, of course, is relative. The Great Rest could still kill you if someone miscalculated the dose, but it killed you less often than opium alone at equivalent pain-relieving doses, and it was far less addictive. That's sophisticated pharmacology achieved without any understanding of chemistry or molecular biology. Just observation and careful record-keeping and the accumulated experience of physicians who had seen thousands of patients. Surgery in the medieval period is brutal by modern standards. There's no understanding of germ theory, no concept of infection as something caused by microorganisms. But there is pain management. Before attempting an amputation or removing an arrow lodged in bone or cutting open an abscess, a surgeon will give the patient a preparation containing henbane. Sometimes it's the Great Rest. Sometimes it's a simpler formula, just henbane and wine. Sometimes it's administered as a drink. Sometimes it's applied to a cloth that the patient breathes through, the active compounds absorbing through the mucous membranes of the mouth and nose. The goal isn't complete unconsciousness. That's actually dangerous because an unconscious patient can't cough or swallow, and if they vomit while sedated, they might aspirate and die. The goal is a state called twilight sleep. The patient is technically awake, but profoundly dissociated from what's happening to their body. They can follow simple commands. They can breathe on their own, but they're not fully present. The pain signals still reach the brain, but they're muted, distant, processed through a fog of chemical interference that makes them tolerable. Imagine being the surgeon. You're working by candlelight or daylight through a window. Your patient is making sounds, not quite screams, but low moans that tell you they're still feeling something. Your tools are knives and saws that you've heated in flame to cauterize as you cut. You have to work fast because the henbane won't last forever, and if you take too long, the patient will come fully awake mid-procedure. You have no way to monitor vital signs beyond pressing your fingers to their neck to feel the pulse. If you gave them too much henbane, their heart rate will drop, their breathing will slow, and they might slip into a coma you can't reverse. If you gave them too little, they'll start thrashing, and you'll have to physically restrain them while you finish. This is the calculus of medieval surgery. Every single time, dental work presents similar challenges. Toothache in the medieval period isn't just painful, it's potentially fatal because dental infections can spread to the jaw and from there to the blood. Extraction is often the only option. The procedure is agonizing and the patient is awake for all of it. So medieval dentists develop a technique using henbane seeds. They place the seeds on hot coals or charcoal and have the patient lean over the smoke, breathing it in. The fumes contain volatilized alkaloids that are absorbed through the respiratory system, producing rapid analgesia and dissociation. Within minutes, the patient is calm enough to endure having a tooth wrenched out with metal pincers. Some practitioners take advantage of this technique to perform elaborate frauds. They tell patients that toothache is caused by worms living in the tooth. After administering the henbane smoke, while the patient is disoriented and suggestible, they secretly drop small pieces of lute string into a bowl of water. Then they show the patient the wriggling strings and claim these are the worms that have been expelled from their mouth by the power of the treatment. The patient, already paid for the procedure and wanting to believe they've been cured, sees what they expect to see. It's a con, but it's a con built on the real analgesic properties of henbane, and the tooth has actually been removed. So in some sense the treatment works even if the explanation is nonsense. The Catholic Church's position on henbane during this period is complicated. On one hand, it's legitimate medicine. Monastic infirmaries use it. Texts copied in monastery scriptoriums describe it. There's nothing inherently sinful about a plant. But on the other hand, there's a growing anxiety about the way henbane affects consciousness. The visions it produces, the sense of leaving one's body, the way it seems to open doors to other realms of experience. All of this makes church authorities nervous. Is it medicine or is it sorcery? The distinction matters enormously in an age where accusations of witchcraft are beginning to carry death sentences. The official position, when it's articulated at all, is that intention matters. If a physician administers henbane to relieve suffering, that's medicine. If a peasant uses it to see visions or communicate with spirits, that's potentially demonic. But in practice, these categories blur. A village healer who uses henbane to treat a child's convulsions is performing medicine. The same healer using the same plant to enter a trance and diagnose the spiritual cause of an illness is performing something else. And increasingly, that something else is dangerous to perform. Evidence of henbane's widespread use comes from archaeological sources. Seeds have been found at medieval hospital sites across Europe. At St. Giles Hospital near Brompton Bridge in England, archaeologists found henbane seeds in contexts that clearly indicate medical use. The quantities are small, which is exactly what you'd expect. Henbane isn't a food crop. It's not used in large amounts. A few seeds, carefully stored, represent a valuable medical resource. Finding even small quantities in archaeological deposits tells you that the plant was deliberately collected, processed, and stored by people who knew what they were doing. Trade records from the later medieval period show henbane moving along commercial routes. When the Danish-Norwegian flagship Gribsjunden sank in 1495 near Ronneby, Sweden, archaeologists recovering the wreck found henbane among the ship's stores. This was a royal vessel, carrying supplies for a diplomatic mission. The presence of henbane suggests it was considered valuable enough to stock for the voyage, probably for treating seasickness or toothache, common problems on long sea journeys. The alkaloids in henbane are effective antiemetics, meaning they suppress nausea, which would make them useful on a ship. But they also cause dry mouth and blurred vision, which on a pitching deck in rough seas might be worse than the seasickness. Medieval sailors made these trade-offs all the time. By the end of the 14th century, Henbane occupies a well-established place in European medical practice. It's in the herbals. It's in the monasteries. It's in the treatment protocols taught at medical schools. Physicians understand its properties, its dangers, its uses. They know how to harvest it at the right time of year, how to dry it to preserve potency, how to prepare it in forms that allow controlled dosing. This is professional knowledge, accumulated over more than a millennium, refined through the treatment of countless patients. It represents one of medieval medicine's genuine achievements, the ability to manage pain and consciousness using plant-derived compounds whose mechanisms they don't understand, but whose effects they can predict and control. But that professional control is about to be challenged. Because in the next century, as social anxieties spike and authorities begin hunting for scapegoats, everyone with too much knowledge about plants like Henbane will find themselves suspect. The healers who learned these skills from their mothers and grandmothers, who never attended medical schools, who work outside official church approval, they're about to become targets. And the plant that has served humanity as medicine for thousands of years is about to become evidence of devil worship. Chapter 4. The Darkening Reputation. 1400 to 1600 of the Common Era. The shift doesn't happen overnight. There's no single moment when Henbane transforms from medicine to malefice, no decree that suddenly makes its use suspect. Instead, it's a slow poisoning of perception that takes place over 2 centuries as Europe descends into one of the darkest chapters of its history. The witch hunts that will eventually claim tens of thousands of lives are building momentum, fed by religious anxiety, social upheaval, and the fundamental human need to find someone to blame when things go wrong. And Henbane, with its power to alter consciousness and produce visions, is about to become Exhibit A in thousands of trials that end in torture and fire. The roots of the panic go back further than most people realize. In 1250, a Dominican friar named Albertus Magnus writes a massive encyclopedia of natural knowledge called De Vegetalibus. Albertus is trying to compile everything known about plants, drawing on classical sources and contemporary observations. When he gets to Henbane, he includes a disturbing detail. Necromancers, he reports, use this plant to invoke the souls of the dead and to summon demons. He doesn't explain how he knows this. He doesn't provide sources. But the claim is now in writing, in a text that will be copied and distributed and cited for centuries. The association between Henbane and communication with evil spirits has been officially documented by a respected scholar. At this point, it's still possible to maintain the distinction between legitimate medical use and diabolical practice. But that distinction requires trust in the person administering the plant. And as the 14th century gives way to the 15th, trust is collapsing. The Black Death has killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of Europe's population. The Catholic Church is fracturing, with multiple men claiming to be the true pope. Crop failures and climate change are causing widespread famine. Wars are grinding on for decades. People are desperate for explanations, and the explanation that gains traction is that Satan is actively working in the world through human agents. Witches, sorcerers, devil worshippers who have made pacts with demons in exchange for supernatural powers. The first major witch trial using the new theological framework takes place in 1326 in Kilkenny, Ireland. A woman named Alice Keitler is accused of sorcery and eventually flees the country. Her servant is not so lucky and burns at the stake. But these early trials are relatively rare. It's not until the mid-15th century that the machinery really gets going. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issues a papal bull acknowledging the reality of witchcraft and authorizing inquisitors to root out. 2 years later, 2 German inquisitors published the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, a handbook for identifying, interrogating, and prosecuting suspected witches. The book becomes a bestseller, reprinted dozens of times over the next century. And buried in its pages are references to the plants that witches supposedly use to work their magic. Henbane is prominent among them. The accusations follow predictable patterns. Witches are said to fly to their Sabbaths, secret nighttime gatherings where they worship the devil and plot harm against Christians. They're said to have ointments that enable this flight, salves made from forbidden plants, and unspeakable ingredients. And increasingly, in confession after confession extracted under torture, the same plants keep appearing in the recipes. Henbane, belladonna, mandrake, datura, all members of the nightshade family, all containing tropane alkaloids that cause hallucinations and dissociation. The reality is almost certainly more mundane and more tragic than the inquisitors imagined. What they're documenting, without understanding it, is folk knowledge of psychoactive plants. The ointments are real. They work. If you mix henbane with animal fat and apply to areas of the body where the skin is thin and richly supplied with blood vessels, the armpits, the genitals, the inner thighs, the alkaloids absorb rapidly into the bloodstream. Within minutes, you experience profound dissociation. Your sense of your body's position in space becomes unreliable. You might feel like you're floating, flying, falling. You might have vivid visions. You might completely lose track of time. And the next day, you might remember almost nothing. The method of application is important. Rubbing the ointment on a stick or pole and applying it rectally or vaginally allows even faster absorption through mucous membranes. This is likely the origin of the broomstick imagery that becomes so central to witch iconography. Women in ecstatic trance states, having applied psychoactive ointments using staffs or broom handles, reporting sensations of flight. The image gets literalized, reinterpreted through the lens of diabolical conspiracy theory, and suddenly you have witches flying through the air on broomsticks to attend Sabbaths. It's a misunderstanding of pharmacology repackaged as evidence of supernatural evil. In 1538, a Pomeranian witch trial produces a confession that gives us a glimpse of how henbane was actually being used. A woman admits under torture that she gave a man henbane seeds to make him run around crazy. The word used is revealing. Not possessed, not cursed, crazy. And from the context, it seems to mean sexually aroused or disinhibited. Henbane in certain doses can act as an aphrodisiac, lowering inhibitions and increasing suggestibility. In other words, this is a medieval version of drugging someone, a real crime that has nothing to do with devil worship. But in the trial records, it becomes evidence of witchcraft. The woman is convicted and almost certainly executed. Her knowledge of henbane's effects, knowledge that might have been passed down through generations of healers, dies with her. Another case from an Inquisition trial includes an even more specific detail. A witch confesses to strewing henbane seeds between two lovers while reciting a formula. Here I sow wild seed, and the devil advised that they would hate and avoid each other until these seeds have been separated. This is sympathetic magic, the belief that performing a ritual action can cause a corresponding effect in the world. The logic is that just as the seeds are scattered and separated, so too will the lovers be driven apart. Does it work? Of course not. But if the couple was already having problems, and if one of them knew about the curse, confirmation bias would do the rest. Any subsequent argument would seem like proof of the spell's effectiveness. And now the knowledge that henbane seeds can be used in this ritual is in the Inquisition records, available for prosecutors in future trials to cite as evidence. The confessions pile up. Witches drank decoctions of henbane and had dreams for which they were tortured and executed. Read that sentence again. They had dreams. The crime is consciousness alteration. The crime is accessing states of mind that the authorities consider dangerously outside Christian norms. Yes, the inquisitors believe these aren't ordinary dreams, but devil-sent visions. But from a modern perspective, we're watching people being killed for ingesting a plant and experiencing its predictable pharmacological effects. In Germany, folklore develops claiming that henbane attracts rain and causes sterility in land and livestock. These beliefs are almost certainly backward rationalizations. If you want to explain why a drought broke or why cattle are failing to breed, and you know that the suspected witch is henbane growing near her cottage, the plant becomes the explanation. And since causing bad weather and blighting crops are among the most common accusations in witch trials, having henbane on your property becomes circumstantial evidence of maleficia, harmful magic. The fact that henbane is also useful medicine, that any competent healer would want to have it available, doesn't matter. The context has shifted. The plant itself has become suspicious. One particularly detailed account describes a weather magic ritual. If there's a great drought, a stalk of henbane is dipped into a spring, then sun-baked sand is sprinkled with the water. This is probably a folk practice with pre-Christian origins, the kind of agricultural magic that farming communities across Europe have performed for centuries. But now it's being documented as evidence of witchcraft, as proof that certain people have made pacts with demons to control the weather. The ritual doesn't work, of course, but in an age before meteorology, when drought can mean starvation and no one understands what actually causes rain, these explanations are as good as any other. And they have the advantage of providing someone to blame. The persecution isn't random. The victims follow patterns. They're disproportionately women, especially older women. They're often healers or midwives, people with specialized knowledge of herbs and bodies. They're frequently poor, marginal members of their communities who lack powerful protectors. And they're usually people who have had conflicts with their neighbors over property, livestock, perceived slights. The witch trial becomes a way to settle scores, to eliminate competition, to seize property. The accusations of diabolical magic are the justification, but the motivations are brutally mundane. And henbane keeps appearing in the trial records. It's in the ointments. It's in the brews. It's in the rituals. Prosecutors wave bundles of the dried plant in courtrooms as physical evidence. Look at this devil's herb found in the accused home. See these seeds she kept hidden in a pouch. Smell the foul stench of this ungodly plant. The fact that the plant is also stocked by licensed physicians and monasteries gets ignored. Context collapses. A plant is a plant, except when it's found in the wrong hands, and then it becomes proof of evil. The physical characteristics of henbane get reinterpreted through this dark lens. The sticky, glandular hairs that cover the leaves and stems, the ones that leave residue on your hands when you touch the plant, are now described as evidence of its unnatural, demonic nature. The flowers with their pale yellow petals and purple veins look sinister rather than beautiful. The smell, which has always been unpleasant, becomes the stench of hell itself. Common names proliferate. Devil's eye, poison tobacco, stinking nightshade. Each name reinforces the association between the plant and evil. Shakespeare, writing at the tail end of this period, taps into the cultural association when he needs a poison for his greatest tragedy. In Hamlet, the murder that sets the entire plot in motion involves cursed Hebbanon poured into the king's ear while he sleeps. Hebbanon is almost certainly henbane. The method of administration, through the ear, is medically nonsensical but dramatically powerful. And it works as a plot device because Shakespeare's audience would have immediately understood henbane as the weapon of choice for secret murder. Its reputation has been so thoroughly darkened that it functions in literature as a symbol of treachery and unnatural death. But here's what makes this period so tragic. While thousands of people are being tortured and executed for possessing or using henbane, the plant remains part of legitimate medicine. Physicians are still prescribing it. Pharmacies are still stocking it. Medical texts are still describing proper preparation and dosing. The only difference is who's using it and what authorities stand behind them. A licensed male physician trained at a university administering henbane to a nobleman is practicing medicine. An unlicensed female healer giving the same plant to a peasant is practicing witchcraft. The plant hasn't changed. The chemistry hasn't changed. What's changed is the social and religious context that determines whether knowledge is legitimate or damnable. By the early 1600s, as the witch hunts reach their peak, henbane's transformation is complete. What ancient Greeks considered a gift from Apollo, what Roman surgeons relied on to save soldiers' lives, what medieval physicians carefully integrated into sophisticated analgesic formulations, is now primarily associated with devil worship and malevolent magic. The accumulated medical knowledge of millennia is still there, still being practiced, but it's been poisoned by association. And the people who carried folk knowledge of the plant, the village healers and wise women who learned from their mothers and grandmothers, have been terrorized into silence or murdered outright. An entire tradition of botanical medicine is being destroyed in the name of fighting an imaginary conspiracy of Satan worshippers. The real tragedy is that both the medicine and the supposed magic are the same thing. Just chemistry, just alkaloids interacting with neurons. But in an age that doesn't understand chemistry and desperately needs to believe in clear boundaries between good and evil, that distinction is impossible to maintain. Chapter 5. The Science of Madness. 1600 and 1900 of the Common Era. The witch hunts don't end cleanly. They taper off through the 17th century as exhaustion sets in and authorities begin to question whether the epidemic of devil worship they've been fighting was ever real. The last legal execution for witchcraft in Europe happens in 1782 in Switzerland. A servant woman named Anna Goldie is beheaded for allegedly poisoning a child with her saliva. The charges are almost certainly fabricated. The execution is recognized, even at the time, as a barbaric relic of a superstitious age. But it takes that long for the machinery of witch hunting to finally grind to a halt. And in the aftermath, as the smoke clears and Europe begins to count its dead, there's a question that needs answering. What actually was happening? What were these plants doing to people's minds? The scientific revolution is already underway by the time the witch hunts end. Galileo has looked through telescopes and seen moons orbiting Jupiter. Newton has worked out the mathematics of gravity and motion. The microscope has revealed a hidden world of tiny organisms invisible to the naked eye. And slowly, methodically, investigators are beginning to turn these new tools of inquiry toward the natural world's pharmacology. If plants can alter consciousness, there must be a reason. There must be something in the plant, some substance that enters the body and causes these effects. The age of chemistry is beginning, and Henbane is about to be taken apart molecule by molecule. Early attempts to understand Henbane focus on categorizing its effects with more precision than previous generations managed. Physicians document case studies. They note the dose-dependent nature of the response. At very low doses, slight sedation and dry mouth. At moderate doses, hallucinations and dissociation. At high doses, seizures and death. The pattern is consistent across patients, which suggests there's something systematic happening. Not divine intervention or demonic possession, but a predictable interaction between substance and body. This is a revolutionary way of thinking. It strips away the supernatural explanations and replaces them with mechanism. If you can understand the mechanism, you can control it. In 1753, a Swedish botanist named Carl Linnaeus publishes Species Plantarum, establishing the modern system of biological nomenclature. Henbane gets its formal scientific name, Hyoscyamus niger. The genus name comes from the Greek words for pig and bean, a reference to the belief that pigs can eat the plant without being poisoned. The species name, niger, means black, referring to the dark seeds and purple-black throat of the flower. It's a small thing, a name, but it matters. It means that physicians in Sweden and Italy and England are all talking about exactly the same plant. It means that research can be compared across borders and languages. Standardization is the foundation of science. The next breakthrough comes from chemistry. Through the late 18th and early 19th centuries, chemists developed techniques for isolating pure compounds from plant material. They grind up leaves and seeds, extract them with alcohol or other solvents, separate the components through crystallization and distillation. It's painstaking work. One plant might yield dozens of different substances, and figuring out which one causes which effect requires endless testing. But slowly, the picture comes into focus. In 1819, German chemists successfully isolate a pure crystalline alkaloid from henbane. They call it hyoscyamine. It's the first of henbane's active compounds to be identified. Hyoscyamine is just the beginning. Further research reveals that henbane actually contains 34 different alkaloids, chemical compounds that all share a similar structure based on nitrogen-containing rings. The three most important are hyoscyamus, atropine, and scopolamine. Atropine is actually a racemic mixture, meaning it contains both left-handed and right-handed versions of the hyoscyamus molecule, created during the extraction process when heat causes some of the molecules to flip their three-dimensional structure. Scopolamine, also called hyoscine, is chemically similar but produces slightly different effects. All three are tropane alkaloids, members of a family of compounds that also includes cocaine, and all three work by interfering with a specific neurotransmitter system. The neurotransmitter in question is acetylcholine. It's one of the chemical messengers that neurons use to communicate with each other and with muscle cells. When an electrical signal reaches the end of a nerve, it triggers the release of acetylcholine into the tiny gap between cells. The acetylcholine molecules drift across this gap and bind to receptors on the next cell, triggering a response. This is how your brain tells your heart to beat, how it tells your muscles to contract, how it processes sensory information. Tropane alkaloids from Henbane block these receptors. They fit into the same binding sites that acetylcholine normally occupies, but they don't activate the receptor. They just sit there, preventing the real acetylcholine from getting through. The technical term is anticholinergic. The effect is that certain neural signals stop getting transmitted properly. The specific symptoms of Henbane poisoning all make sense once you understand this mechanism. Acetylcholine normally tells your salivary glands to produce spit. Block that signal and your mouth goes dry. It tells your pupils to constrict in bright light. Block it and they dilate. It helps regulate heart rate, smooth muscle contractions in your digestive system, and plays crucial roles in memory formation and consciousness. Block acetylcholine transmission throughout the nervous system, and you get the full constellation of Henbane effects. Blurred vision, rapid heartbeat, inability to urinate, confusion, hallucinations, amnesia, at high enough doses, seizures and respiratory failure. This understanding transforms medicine. Once you know what Henbane is doing at molecular level, you can start to predict when it might be useful. You can also start to understand why certain combinations of drugs work better than others. The medieval Great Rest formula that combined Henbane with opium wasn't just folk wisdom. It was taking advantage of the fact that these compounds work through completely different mechanisms. Opium blocks pain signals by acting on opioid receptors. Henbane blocks them by causing dissociation through anticholinergic effects. Together, they produce more complete pain relief than either could alone. The medieval physicians who worked this out didn't know about receptors or neurotransmitters, but they understood the practical result. Now, for the first time, scientists can explain why. The 19th century sees Henbane cultivation become increasingly standardized and commercial. The demand from pharmacies and hospitals is growing as populations expand and medical care becomes more widely available. But growing Henbane reliably proves challenging. The plant is capricious. Seeds can remain dormant in soil for years before germinating. Sometimes they refuse to germinate at all. Crops vary wildly in alkaloid content depending on weather, soil conditions, and timing of harvest. A batch of dried leaves from one field might be twice as potent as a batch from the next field over. For pharmaceutical use, this variation is dangerous. You need consistent potency to dose safely. The British Pharmacopoeia, first published in 1864, attempts to solve this problem by setting standards. Dried Henbane leaves sold for medical use must contain between 0.045 and 0.14% total alkaloids. Anything outside that range is rejected. This forces growers to test their crops and ensures that physicians can prescribe with some confidence about what dose they're actually giving. It's still not as precise as modern pharmaceuticals, but it's vastly better than the medieval situation where every preparation was unique. England becomes a major producer of pharmaceutical-grade Henbane. The plant grows well in the British climate, and there's strong domestic demand for fresh leaves used in making extracts and tinctures. But England alone can't supply the entire market. Large quantities of dried Henbane are imported from Germany, Austria, and Russia, where the annual variety of the plant is cultivated specifically for pharmaceutical export. This international trade in medicinal plants is part of the broader globalization happening in the 19th century. A doctor in London might be prescribing henbane grown in Russia, processed according to German standards, and shipped across Europe by rail. Not all henbane is equal, and physicians learn to distinguish between species. Hyoscyamus muticus, Egyptian henbane, grows in the Middle East and India. It looks similar to the European variety, but contains much higher concentrations of alkaloids, often exceeding 1.25%, and that alkaloid is almost pure hyoscyamine rather than the mixture found in European plants. This makes Egyptian henbane far more potent and more dangerous. Its use as a substitute is explicitly warned against in medical texts. You can tell it apart by examining the plant structure. The stems are paler and thicker. The capsules that contain the seeds are more elongated. The leaves are narrower and lack the distinctive large lobes of European henbane. For a physician trying to ensure patient safety, these botanical details matter enormously. Despite the growing understanding of henbane's chemistry and effects, it remains dangerous. Overdoses happen. Death from henbane poisoning is documented regularly in medical literature and sometimes in criminal cases. The progression is predictable and terrible. First comes agitation and confusion. The victim can't sit still, can't focus, sees things that aren't there. Their skin flushes red. Their pupils dilate so wide that their eyes look black. Their heart races. They might pick at imaginary objects in the air, a behavior so characteristic of anticholinergic poisoning that physicians have a name for it. Carphology. The plucking of bedclothes. As the dose increases, the agitation gives way to seizures. Muscles lock. The jaw clenches. Breathing becomes irregular. And finally, the heart stops or the respiratory muscles fail. There's no antidote. Nothing reverses the process. You can only provide supportive care, keep the patient breathing, control the seizures with other drugs, and wait for their body to metabolize the poison. Some survive. Many don't. Yet legitimate medical use continues throughout this period. Henbane is prescribed for asthma, using its bronchodilating effects to help patients breathe. For motion sickness, taking advantage of its antiemetic properties. For painful muscle spasms and menstrual cramps, using its antispasmodic effects. For insomnia in cases where opium is unsuitable. The plant has moved from the realm of folk medicine into official pharmacology, its place secure by centuries of documented efficacy, and now explained by modern chemistry. The self-experimenters provide some of the most vivid descriptions of henbane's effects. In 1966, a German writer named Gustav Schenk publishes an account of deliberately inhaling smoke from burning henbane seeds. He describes clenched teeth and dizzy rage, a peculiar sense of well-being mixed with the sensation that his feet were growing lighter and breaking loose from his body. Each part of his body seemed to be going off on its own. He felt he was falling apart, while simultaneously experiencing an intoxicating sensation of flying. He saw hallucinations, clouds, herds of beasts, falling leaves, billowing streamers of steam, and rivers of molten metal. The description matches reports from centuries earlier, from Greek priestesses and accused witches and Viking berserkers. The plant hasn't changed. Human neurology hasn't changed. What's changed is that Schenk can write about his experience without fear of being burned at the stake. These self-experimentation accounts are valuable scientifically because they document subjective effects that can't be captured by external observation. You can measure heart rate and pupil dilation, but you can't measure what it feels like to lose your sense of bodily integrity or to see visions overlaid on reality. The phenomenology of the henbane experience, the actual texture of the altered state it produces, comes through in these first-person descriptions. And what emerges consistently is that it's profoundly unpleasant. Unlike alcohol or opioids, which produce euphoria that encourages repeated use, henbane produces dissociation and dysphoria. You might use it once out of curiosity. You might use it because you're in terrible pain and have no other options. But you don't use it recreationally. The experience is too disturbing, too physically uncomfortable, too likely to go wrong. By the end of the 19th century, Henbane occupies a well-defined niche in medicine. It's not a miracle cure. It's not prescribed casually. But for certain specific indications, it remains useful. The pure alkaloids extracted from it are beginning to replace crude plant preparations. Scopolamine and hyoscyamus can be obtained as pharmaceutical-grade compounds with known potency, allowing far more precise dosing than was ever possible with dried leaves or tinctures. The era of synthetic and semi-synthetic drugs is approaching. Soon it will be possible to manufacture these compounds in chemical factories without needing to grow plants at all. But that transformation is still decades away. For now, Henbane fields in England and Central Europe continue producing raw material for pharmaceutical extraction, continuing a tradition of cultivation that stretches back to Roman times. The scientific understanding achieved during these 3 centuries represents a genuine revolution in how humans think about consciousness-altering plants. The supernatural explanations are gone, replaced by chemistry and neurology. But something has also been lost. The sense of mystery, the connection to ancient ritual practices, the folk knowledge passed down through generations. As Henbane moves from the healer's garden into the pharmaceutical factory, it becomes standardized, controlled, measured. Safer, certainly. More reliable. But also somehow diminished. Just another chemical compound among thousands. Its strange history fading from memory as the 20th century approaches. Chapter 6. Decline and Transformation. 1900 and 1970 of the Common Era. The 20th century arrives with promises of progress that feel almost utopian. Electricity is lighting cities. Automobiles are replacing horses. The Wright brothers will soon achieve powered flight. And in laboratories across Europe and America, chemists are learning to synthesize complex molecules that previously could only be extracted from plants. This is the beginning of the pharmaceutical revolution, and it will fundamentally change Henbane's role in human society. The plant that has been harvested and cultivated for 6,000 years is about to become obsolete, even as the chemicals it produces become more important than ever. The shift happens gradually. In 1900, if you visit a pharmacy, you'll still find preparations made directly from henbane. Tinctures, extracts, dried leaves sold by weight. These are what physicians prescribe and what pharmacists dispense. But chemists are working on something better. They're developing methods to synthesize atropine, hyoscyamus, and scopolamine in industrial quantities without needing to grow plants at all. The advantages are obvious. No more worrying about variable alkaloid content between harvests. No more depending on weather and soil conditions. No more agricultural labor and land devoted to a crop that's toxic and temperamental. Just pure compounds manufactured to exact specifications, identical batch after batch. The first successful commercial synthesis of atropine happens in 1901. It's not economically competitive with plant extraction at first. The process is complicated and expensive. But over the following decades, improvements in chemical manufacturing drive costs down while quality control improves. By the 1920s, synthetic atropine is beginning to replace plant-derived material in pharmaceutical supply chains. By the 1940s, the transition is largely complete. Henbane is still grown in some places, still cultivated for pharmaceutical extraction, but the quantities are dropping. The future belongs to the factory, not the field. This transformation might seem like pure progress, and in many ways it is. Synthetic drugs are safer. They're more reliable. A physician prescribing synthetic scopolamine knows exactly what dose the patient is receiving. There's no guessing about potency, no risk that this batch of plant material happens to be unusually strong or weak. Lives are saved by this predictability. But something is also being lost. The knowledge of how to cultivate henbane, how to harvest it at the right time, how to process it to preserve alkaloid content. This expertise is becoming obsolete. The people who hold it are aging. Their children and grandchildren have no reason to learn skills that the pharmaceutical industry has made unnecessary. The two world wars accelerate everything. War always does. Both conflicts create massive demand for medical supplies, including drugs that can manage pain, prevent shock, and treat battlefield injuries. Scopolamine, derived from henbane, sees extensive use. It's administered to soldiers before surgery to dry secretions that might cause choking while under anesthesia. It's used in combination with morphine to create what's called twilight sleep, a state where the patient is sedated but not fully unconscious. This protocol is particularly popular in obstetrics. Women in labor are given scopolamine and morphine, and they experience childbirth in a dissociated state, often with complete amnesia for the event afterward. Whether this is actually better for the mother than feeling the pain, but remembering what happened is debated then and remains controversial now. During the First World War, supply chains for medicinal plants are disrupted. Germany, which had been a major supplier of pharmaceutical-grade henbane to other European nations, is now an enemy. Britain and France suddenly need to produce their own supply or find alternative sources. Cultivation expands in England. Emergency contracts are issued to farmers willing to grow medicinal plants. The government provides seeds and instructions and guaranteed purchase prices. It's a crash course in pharmaceutical agriculture, driven by military necessity. Some of these wartime cultivation programs continue after the armistice, but many shut down as soon as cheaper imports become available again. The Second World War repeats the pattern. Once again, international trade collapses. Once again, nations scramble to secure domestic supplies of essential medicines. But this time, synthetic production is far more advanced. The dependence on plant material is lower. Chemical factories can produce scopolamine at scale, and while the raw materials for synthesis still ultimately come from plants, the manufacturing process is less vulnerable to disruption than agricultural cultivation. The war effort drives massive investment in pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity that will continue serving civilian markets for decades after peace is declared. In the post-war period, henbane-derived compounds find new applications. Scopolamine becomes a standard treatment for motion sickness, administered as pills or, eventually, as adhesive patches worn behind the ear. The transdermal patch is a particularly elegant solution. The drug absorbs slowly through the skin, maintaining steady blood levels for days without the need for repeated dosing. For people prone to seasickness on long voyages or nausea during air travel, these patches are genuinely life-changing. The technology is still in use today, a direct descendant of knowledge that goes back to ancient Egypt. Atropine finds use in ophthalmology. Dilating the pupil for eye examinations becomes standard practice, and atropine is ideal for this purpose because it works quickly and reliably. Mescaline, cannabis. There's a flowering of interest in altered states and a rejection of the straight society that sees such experiences as dangerous or immoral. And in this context, some people rediscover henbane. The ethnobotanical literature is available for anyone willing to dig through university libraries. The account from self-experimenters like Gustav Schenk are there to read. A small number of psychonauts decide to try it themselves. It never catches on. The reasons are straightforward. Henbane is deeply unpleasant. The physical effects, dry mouth, blurred vision, difficulty urinating, elevated heart rate, are uncomfortable and sometimes frightening. The psychological effects are dysphoric rather than euphoric. The hallucinations are confused and disturbing rather than transcendent. And the margin between an active dose and a toxic dose is narrow enough that every experiment carries real risk. People who try it once generally don't try it again. Word spreads through the psychedelic community that henbane is something to avoid. It doesn't produce the kinds of experiences that people are looking for. It's just dangerous and unpleasant. There's also a practical problem. The alkaloid content in any given henbane plant is unpredictable. Two plants growing side by side might have wildly different potencies. There's no way for an amateur to test alkaloid levels. No simple method to ensure you're taking a consistent dose. In an era before widespread access to chemical analysis, this makes self-experimentation with Henbane essentially Russian roulette. Some underground chemists with access to laboratory equipment manage to extract pure alkaloids and experiment with known doses, but these are rare exceptions. For the vast majority of people interested in consciousness alteration, Henbane is simply too risky. Academic interest tells a different story. Ethnobotanists in the 1960s and 70s are documenting traditional plant use in cultures around the world before that knowledge is completely lost to modernization. They interview elderly herbalists. They record preparation methods. They collect specimens. And Henbane appears regularly in their field notes. In various cultures, it's still being used medicinally for treating toothache, asthma, and nervous conditions. In some places, it's still part of traditional rituals. But even as these researchers document the practices, they're watching them fade. The younger generation isn't learning. The chain of transmission is breaking. What's being recorded is often the last iteration of traditions that will not survive another generation. One researcher in India documents the use of Henbane oil in Ayurvedic medicine for treating Parkinson's disease. The traditional practitioners know that Henbane reduces tremors and rigidity. They don't know why, but they've observed it working over generations of practice. Modern pharmacology can explain it. The anticholinergic effects of Henbane alkaloids help balance the dopamine depletion that causes Parkinson's symptoms. It's the same reason that synthetic anticholinergic drugs are still prescribed for Parkinson's today. The traditional healers arrived at this treatment through empirical observation. Modern medicine arrived at it through understanding biochemistry. Both paths lead to the same place. By 1970, Henbane occupies a strange twilight zone. The plant itself is largely forgotten outside of botanical gardens and the occasional wild population growing in waste places. Most people have never heard of it. Those who have think of it, if they think of it at all, as a medieval oddity, something associated with witches and superstition. But the alkaloids extracted from it or synthesized in its image remain essential pharmaceuticals. Scopolamine patches for motion sickness, atropine for eye dilation and emergency medicine, hyoscyamus for treating intestinal cramping and irritable bowel syndrome. These drugs are used millions of times per year. They save lives. They relieve suffering. And almost no one using them has any idea that they're essentially refined Henbane. The disconnect is total. A patient getting an eye exam doesn't think about ancient Greek priestesses inhaling Henbane fumes at Delphi. A sailor wearing a scopolamine patch doesn't think about medieval physicians brewing Henbane tea for surgery patients. A person taking hyoscyamus for stomach cramps doesn't think about Viking berserkers or accused witches or any of the vast, strange history attached to this plant. The medicine has been completely abstracted from its source, which is, in most ways, exactly what modern pharmaceutical science is supposed to achieve. Strip away the folklore and superstition and historical baggage. Isolate the active compounds. Understand the mechanisms. Deliver consistent, reliable treatment. But something nags at the edges of this triumph. The feeling that in gaining precision, we've lost context. That in focusing only on molecular mechanisms, we've stopped asking certain kinds of questions. Why did so many different cultures independently discover Henbane's properties? How did they learn to use it safely in an era before chemistry and pharmacology? What knowledge is encoded in those folk traditions that might still be valuable? These questions aren't answerable through the kind of research that dominates mid-20th century pharmacology. They require different methods, different perspectives, different kinds of expertise. And for several decades, essentially no one is asking them. The plan is obsolete. The history is irrelevant. Only the chemistry matters. That assumption will hold until a new generation of researchers begins to suspect that maybe, just maybe, there's still something to learn from the past. But that realization is still years away, waiting for someone to connect dots that most people don't even know are there. The effect can last for days, which is inconvenient for the patient who has to deal with blurred near vision and light sensitivity, but useful for the doctor who needs the pupil to stay dilated during examination and treatment. Atropine is also kept on hand in emergency rooms for treating certain types of poisoning, particularly from pesticides that work by overwhelming the acetylcholine system. If someone is poisoned by an organophosphate compound, atropine can literally save their life by blocking the excessive acetylcholine activity. But while pharmaceutical applications are expanding, crude henbane itself is disappearing from medical practice. By 1950, essentially no physician in the developed world is prescribing raw plant material. Everything is synthetic or semi-synthetic compounds with precise dosing and quality control. The herbals that were standard references for centuries are gathering dust in medical libraries. Medical students aren't taught to recognize henbane plants anymore. That knowledge, which every physician would have needed in 1800, is simply irrelevant in 1950. The connection between the plant and the medicine has been severed. Folk use is dying out too. As modern medicine becomes more accessible and more trusted, people stop consulting traditional healers. The village wise woman who might have kept henbane in her garden and known how to prepare it safely is being replaced by clinics with trained nurses and physicians who prescribe manufactured drugs. There's no shame in this. Modern medicine is genuinely better at most things. But an entire tradition of botanical knowledge is evaporating. The women who learned from their mothers and grandmothers, who carried oral traditions stretching back centuries or millennia, are the last links in a chain that's breaking. When they die, what they know dies with them. The 1960s bring an unexpected development. The counterculture movement embraces psychedelic drugs as tools for consciousness exploration and spiritual development. LSD, psilocybin mushrooms. Chapter 7. Rediscovery in Modern Science. 1970 to 2020 of the Common Era. The pendulum is about to swing back. Not all the way. The era of village healers cultivating henbane in cottage gardens is gone forever, and probably should be. But in universities and research institutions across the developed world, scholars are beginning to ask a radical question. What if the ancients weren't just stumbling around in ignorance? What if the medical knowledge encoded in historical texts and folk traditions represents genuine empirical discovery that modern science has overlooked or dismissed? What if there's still something to learn from people who practiced medicine for millennia without understanding chemistry or biology? This shift starts quietly. A medievalist at the University of Toronto named Nicholas Everett is translating old medical texts in the early 2000s. He's working on something called the Alphabet of Galen, a Latin pharmacological text that describes nearly 300 traditional medicines. Everett isn't just translating the words. He's trying to understand what these remedies actually did, whether they worked, how medieval physicians thought about disease and treatment. And he keeps bumping into formulations that seem surprisingly sophisticated. Combinations of plants that modern pharmacology would recognize as synergistic. Doses that fall within ranges we'd still consider therapeutic. Evidence that suggests medieval medicine wasn't just superstition and bloodletting. Some of it was genuinely effective. In 2014, Everett collaborates with a pharmacology graduate student named Martino Gabra. Together, they publish a paper that will help launch an entirely new field of research. They take the Great Rest, that medieval sedative formula containing opium, henbane, and mandrake, and analyze it using modern pharmacokinetic principles. They calculate what happens in the human body when you take this combination of drugs. How quickly each compound is absorbed. How it's metabolized. What blood levels would be reached. What effects those levels would produce. And they discover something remarkable. The formula isn't just a random mixture of sedative plants. It's actually brilliantly designed. The henbane component, they realize, serves a specific purpose beyond simple sedation. It causes rapid dissociation, a sense of detachment from your own body that kicks in within 20 minutes of administration. This dissociative effect makes repeated self-administration unlikely because the experience is profoundly uncomfortable even while it relieves pain. In other words, henbane acts as a brake on opium addiction. It lets you get the analgesic benefits of the opiate without the euphoric high that drives compulsive use. Medieval physicians discovered this through trial and error over centuries. They had no concept of addiction neuroscience or dopamine reward pathways. They just knew that this particular combination worked better and caused fewer problems than opium alone. This is the first assessment of a medieval drug using modern pharmacokinetic methods. Everett and Gabor call their approach historical pharmacology. The response from the academic community is immediate and enthusiastic. Here's a methodology that can test whether traditional remedies actually worked, that can explain why certain combinations of plants were preferred, that can potentially uncover therapeutic insights that modern medicine has missed. Because the reality is that pharmaceutical companies have been screening random compounds for decades with mixed success. What if instead of random screening, you started with formulations that have already been tested through thousands of years of human use? What if traditional medicine represents a vast database of empirical research waiting to be analyzed with modern tools? Other researchers begin applying similar methods to different historical remedies. A study on a compound recipe from an Anglo-Saxon medical text called Bald's Leech Book shows that the full combination of ingredients has antibacterial activity greater than any individual component. The ancient recipe isn't just throwing random plants together. It's achieving synergistic effects through combinations that enhance each other's properties. This is sophisticated pharmacology achieved without any understanding of bacteria or molecular biology. Just observation. Just careful documentation of what works. Meanwhile, an entirely different line of research is about to overturn conventional wisdom about Viking history. In 2019, ethnobotanist Karsten Fader at the University of Ljubljana publishes a paper in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology that will make international headlines. The title is Sagas of the Solanaceae, Speculative Ethnobotanical Perspectives on the Norse Berserkers. And in it, Fader makes the case that if Viking berserkers used drugs to achieve their legendary battle fury, that drug was almost certainly Henbane, not the fly agaric mushrooms that popular culture and even academic literature has long assumed. Fader's methodology is systematic and thorough. He compiles every detailed description of berserker behavior from Norse sagas and historical accounts. He creates a symptom profile: chills and trembling at onset, facial swelling and redness, violent rage and loss of discrimination between friend and enemy, apparent invulnerability to pain, followed by profound exhaustion and multi-day recovery periods involving headaches and blurred vision. Then he compares this profile against every psychoactive plant that was available in Scandinavia during the Viking Age and has been found in archaeological contexts. Most candidates can be ruled out immediately. Wrong geography, wrong effects, wrong archaeological evidence. Only one plant keeps showing up: black henbane. And when Fader compares the symptom profile of henbane intoxication to the descriptions of berserker rage, the match is remarkable. The anticholinergic effects explain the facial flushing and swelling. The dissociation and aggression explain the combat behavior. The analgesic properties explain the pain resistance. The prosopagnosia, the inability to recognize faces that's characteristic of anticholinergic poisoning, explains why berserkers reportedly couldn't distinguish allies from enemies. And critically, the aftermath symptoms match. Henbane causes persistent headaches and visual disturbances. Fly agaric doesn't. The archaeological evidence supports this theory. Those henbane seeds found in the Volva's grave at Firket aren't an isolated find. Henbane appears at numerous Viking Age sites. The plant was clearly known and used in Norse culture. And unlike fly agaric, which would have made warriors drowsy and uncoordinated, henbane in the right dose produces exactly the kind of dissociated, pain-resistant, aggressive state that the sagas described. Fader is careful to acknowledge that this remains speculative. The berserkers kept their method secret. No written recipe survives. We don't know how the plant was prepared or administered, but every piece of available evidence points in the same direction. If you're trying to explain berserker behavior using pharmacology rather than mythology, henbane is by far the most plausible candidate. The paper generates enormous interest. Major media outlets cover it. Netflix features the research and articles about Vikings. Suddenly, after decades of being forgotten outside of specialized botanical and pharmacological circles, henbane is back in public consciousness. not as a living medical tradition that's still gone, but as a piece of history that helps us understand how our ancestors achieved things that seemed impossible. The implications extend beyond Vikings and medieval medicine. Modern researchers working on the opioid crisis become interested in the finding that Henbane might reduce opiate addiction potential. Could anticholinergic compounds be used alongside pain medication to preserve analgesic effects while reducing abuse potential? It's a question worth investigating, though the side effects of anticholinergics make it challenging. But the idea that a medieval formula might contain insights relevant to 21st century addiction medicine is exactly what the historical pharmacology approach promises. Archaeological discoveries continue adding to our knowledge. In 2025, researchers published findings from a Roman site at Houten Castellum in the Netherlands. They found a hollowed-out sheep or goat bone, carefully plugged at one end with birch bark tar, filled with over 1,000 black henbane seeds. The object dates to between 70 and 100 of the Common Era. It's clearly a container, deliberately crafted to store and transport these specific seeds. At the same site, they find a henbane flower head that appears to have been left as an offering when the settlement was abandoned. These aren't random finds. They're evidence of intentional, careful use of henbane in Roman frontier society. The bone container is particularly fascinating because it suggests that henbane seeds were valuable enough to require special storage. The person who owned this container wanted to keep the seeds dry, protected, and portable. This was medicine that you carried with you, that you kept close, that mattered. The offering of the flower head suggests the plant had ritual or spiritual significance beyond its medical applications. The Romans, like the Greeks before them, seem to have recognized that henbane was something more than just another drug. It was special, powerful, worth respecting. More broadly, henbane seeds have now been found at 65 of 83 Roman period sites examined in the Netherlands. This is a stunning percentage. It means henbane was ubiquitous in Roman medical practice, not some obscure treatment used only by specialists. Any settlement of reasonable size had access to henbane. People knew how to use it. They used it regularly. The extent of Roman henbane use was far greater than anyone previously suspected. Modern pharmaceutical research continues refining our understanding of tropane alkaloids. Studies confirm that scopolamine has applications in treating nausea and vomiting following surgery. That hyoscyamus helps with irritable bowel syndrome and bladder control issues. That these compounds remain clinically useful for specific indications despite being ancient drugs by pharmaceutical industry standards. New delivery methods are developed. Transdermal patches, extended-release formulations, ways to minimize side effects while maximizing therapeutic benefits. Research in India on henbane's traditional use for Parkinson's disease proves particularly interesting. In Ayurvedic medicine, henbane has been prescribed for tremors and rigidity for centuries. When researchers finally test this scientifically, they find that methanol extract from henbane seeds reduce seizures, body rigidity, and loss of voluntary movement in mouse models of Parkinson's by preventing free radical generation in mitochondria. The traditional healers were right. They didn't know the mechanism, but they correctly identified a therapeutic application through generations of careful observation. This pattern repeats across multiple traditional uses. Henbane for asthma, it's a bronchodilator. Henbane for stomach pain, it's an antispasmodic. Henbane for toothache, it's an analgesic. In case after case, modern science is validating treatments that traditional medicine discovered empirically. The mechanisms are different from what the traditional practitioners believed, but the treatments work. This is the promise of historical pharmacology and ethnobotanical research. Not that everything in traditional medicine is valid, much of it isn't, but that there are genuine discoveries buried in those traditions that deserve serious scientific investigation. The regulatory environment around henbane reflects its odd status. The plant itself is legal to grow in most countries. It's considered a noxious weed in some places, but not a controlled substance. You can cultivate it for ornamental purposes or pharmaceutical extraction without special permits. though selling it for human consumption requires pharmaceutical licensing. The pure alkaloids derived from it are prescription medications, regulated like any other pharmaceutical. But henbane oil, which contains all the alkaloids in unpredictable concentrations, can be sold legally in many jurisdictions without prescription, creating a dangerous regulatory gap. The cultivation for pharmaceutical purposes continues, though at much lower levels than a century ago. Central and Eastern Europe and India remain the main production areas. The plant is grown primarily for alkaloid extraction, with the harvested material sent to pharmaceutical companies that process it into pure compounds. Modern agricultural science has solved some of the germination problems that plagued earlier cultivators. Seeds from the northwest Himalaya require cold stratification or treatment with gibberellic acid to break dormancy. Research has shown that slightly immature seeds germinate better than fully mature ones, allowing growers to optimize harvest timing. By 2020, henbane occupies a unique position in pharmacology. It's simultaneously ancient and cutting-edge. A plant whose use stretches back 6,000 years that's still yielding new research findings. A source of compounds that are both obsolete in their crude form and essential in their purified form. A reminder that the history of medicine isn't a simple story of progress from ignorance to knowledge, but a complex process where insights are discovered, forgotten, rediscovered, and understood in new ways across centuries. The medieval physicians who formulated the Great Rest knew something that took modern pharmacologists 1,000 years to rediscover. The Norse berserkers, if Fader is right, weaponized a plant in ways that seemed like magic, but were actually sophisticated applied pharmacology. The Greek priestesses who inhaled henbane fumes to prophesy were inducing predictable neurological states, not communing with gods, though perhaps in some ways those descriptions amount to the same thing. Chapter 8. Contemporary Status and Legacy. 2020 to present day. We arrive at the present moment. The year is 2025, and henbane's 6,000-year journey through human civilization has brought it to a place that would have been unimaginable to any of the people whose stories we've traced. The plant itself is largely forgotten. Walk into any hospital and ask the staff about henbane, and you'll get blank stares. But mention scopolamine or hyoscyamus, mention the alkaloids that henbane produces, and suddenly you're talking about drugs that are prescribed millions of times per year. The disconnect between source and substance is complete, and yet the connection remains, invisible but unbroken, a thread linking the present to the most ancient past. The pharmaceutical applications today represent the refined endpoint of thousands of years of experimentation. Scopolamine patches are ubiquitous in travel medicine. Anyone who's been on a cruise ship or worked on a fishing vessel knows about the small adhesive patches placed behind the ear that prevent seasickness. The drug absorbs slowly through the skin, maintaining steady blood levels for up to 3 days. Side effects are manageable for most people. Dry mouth, slight drowsiness, some blurred vision, especially for reading, but these are minor inconveniences compared to the misery of severe motion sickness. The patches work. They've made certain careers and activities accessible to people who would otherwise be incapacitated by nausea. Scopolamine also sees continued use in hospitals. After surgery, particularly abdominal surgery, nausea and vomiting are common and potentially dangerous complications. Vomiting stresses surgical incisions. It causes pain. It can lead to aspiration if the patient isn't fully alert. Scopolamine administered intravenously or as a patch prevents this. It's not the only antiemetic available, but remains one of the most effective, especially in combination with other drugs. Operating rooms and recovery units keep it stocked as standard medication. For terminally ill patients in hospice care, scopolamine serves a different purpose. As the body shuts down, secretions can accumulate in the throat and airways, causing what's known as the death rattle, a gurgling sound that's distressing for family members to hear even though the patient is typically unconscious. Scopolamine dries these secretions, creating a quieter, more peaceful end. It's a small mercy, but in those final hours, small mercies matter enormously. Hyoscyamus has carved out its own medical niche. For people with irritable bowel syndrome, a condition that causes unpredictable intestinal cramping and bowel habits, hyoscyamus provides real relief. It works by blocking the acetylcholine signals that cause smooth muscle in the intestinal wall to contract spasmodically. The cramping stops. Patients can function live normally, plan their days without constantly worrying about where the nearest bathroom is located. The drug doesn't cure the underlying condition, but it manages symptoms effectively enough that quality of life improves dramatically. Bladder control issues, another anticholinergic application. As people age or following certain surgeries or neurological conditions, the bladder can become overactive, contracting involuntarily and creating urgent needs to urinate. Hyoscyamus reduces these spasms, giving patients more control. It's not perfect. The same mechanism that relaxes the bladder can make it harder to empty completely, and the dry mouth side effect is nearly universal. But for many patients, the trade-off is worth it. Atropine remains essential in emergency medicine. When someone is poisoned by organophosphate pesticides or certain nerve agents, their acetylcholine system goes into overdrive. Every nerve fires constantly. Muscles contract uncontrollably. Secretions pour from every gland. The victim convulses, suffocates, dies unless treated immediately. Atropine blocks the excessive acetylcholine activity, buying time for other treatments to work. Emergency rooms keep pre-filled atropine syringes ready. Military medics carry auto-injectors. In chemical warfare scenarios or agricultural poisoning cases, atropine is often the difference between life and death. Ophthalmology still relies on atropine for pupil dilation. Before examining the retina or performing certain procedures, eye doctors need the pupil to stay wide open. Atropine drops accomplish this reliably. The effect lasts for days, which means patients leave the office with one eye still dilated, unable to focus on nearby objects, sensitive to light, functionally impaired. It's inconvenient, but medically necessary. And it's the same drug, working through the same mechanism, that Roman physicians used 2,000 years ago when they needed to examine eyes. Beyond these established uses, research continues. The observation from medieval studies that Henbane might reduce opiate addiction potential has caught the attention of researchers working on the opioid crisis. Could anticholinergic compounds be formulated alongside pain medications to preserve analgesic effects while reducing abuse liability? Early investigations are cautious. The side effect profiles of anticholinergics are significant, and creating a combination that's both effective and tolerable is challenging. But the question is being asked, and that alone represents the value of historical pharmacology. A medieval formula is informing 21st century addiction research. The investigation of Henbane's effects on Parkinson's disease is ongoing. Traditional Ayurvedic use suggested efficacy for tremors and rigidity, and laboratory studies have confirmed measurable effects in animal models. Whether this translates to useful treatment in human patients remains unclear. Modern Parkinson's medications are quite effective, and introducing an anticholinergic with unpredictable side effects is hard to justify when better options exist. But the research validates the traditional knowledge. The healers who prescribed Henbane for Parkinson's centuries before the disease even had that name were observing something real. Ethnobotanical documentation continues in the few places where traditional Henbane use persists. Researchers are racing against time to record knowledge before the last practitioners die. In remote areas of India, Pakistan, and parts of Central Asia, elderly healers still know how to prepare Henbane for toothache, asthma, and rheumatic pain. They know the doses. They know the signs of overdose. They know which patients should avoid it. This knowledge represents an unbroken chain stretching back to antiquity, and when these individuals die, the chain breaks. Their children and grandchildren have access to modern medicine. They have no reason to learn plant preparation methods that require years of apprenticeship and carry significant risk. Within a generation, This knowledge will exist only in the notebooks of anthropologists and ethnobotanists. The regulatory status of Henbane reflects the tension between its pharmaceutical importance and its danger. The plant itself is generally legal to grow. Botanical gardens cultivate it. Some herbalists keep it for educational purposes. But selling plant material for human consumption is restricted or prohibited in most developed countries. The pure alkaloids are prescription medications with all the controls that entails. Yet Henbane oil, which contains all the alkaloids in unpredictable and potentially dangerous concentrations, can legally be sold in some jurisdictions. The regulatory framework hasn't caught up with the reality that different forms of the same plant present radically different risk profiles. Safety remains paramount. All parts of Henbane are poisonous to humans and most animals. Accidental poisonings still occur, usually involving children who eat the seeds or people attempting to use the plant medicinally without proper knowledge. Poison control centers handle these cases with protocols developed over decades. Supportive care, controlling agitation with benzodiazepines, monitoring cardiac function. There's still no antidote. You can't reverse anticholinergic poisoning. You can only support the patient through it and hope their body metabolizes the alkaloids before permanent damage occurs. The educational challenge is significant. How do you teach about Henbane's importance to medical history without encouraging dangerous experimentation? How do you acknowledge its role in Viking culture and witchcraft trials and ancient medicine while making clear that attempting to replicate these uses today is potentially fatal? The answer, such as it is, lies in emphasizing context. What made sense in an era without alternatives doesn't make sense now. A Roman surgeon using Henbane because it was the only anesthetic available was making a rational choice. A modern person using it recreationally when safe alternatives exist is making a foolish one. Climate change poses new challenges for wild Henbane populations. The plant has specific habitat preferences. It thrives in disturbed, nitrogen-rich soil in temperate climates. As temperature and precipitation patterns shift, suitable habitat may decrease in some regions while expanding in others. For pharmaceutical companies still relying partially on plant material for alkaloid extraction, this creates supply uncertainties. For conservationists tracking biodiversity, it raises questions about whether Henbane should be monitored or whether, as a toxic weed that adapts readily to disturb habitats, it can take care of itself. The cultural legacy of Henbane extends far beyond pharmacology. It appears in literature, in Shakespeare and earlier texts, always as a signifier of poison and treachery. It shows up in discussions of witch trials, a tangible link between historical persecution and the plants that fed accusations. It's cited in studies of Viking warfare as possible evidence for drug use among berserkers. It appears in the history of beer brewing, in accounts of ancient oracles, in analyses of medieval surgery. The plant has touched so many aspects of human civilization that tracing its influence becomes a way of understanding broader historical patterns. Modern neo-pagan and occult communities have revived interest in Henbane as part of reconstructing historical practices. Some practitioners grow it in ritual gardens, honoring its association with ancient goddess worship and shamanic traditions. They're generally careful not to use it, aware of the dangers, but they value it symbolically. This represents yet another transformation in Henbane's cultural meaning. No longer medicine or poison or witch's tool, but historical artifact, a living connection to practices that once held enormous cultural power. The scientific community continues finding new questions to ask. Research in 2024 explored how Henbane alkaloids affect memory formation and whether this could inform treatments for trauma or post-traumatic stress disorder. The idea that controlled dissociation might help prevent traumatic memories from consolidating draws directly on Henbane's properties. Whether this leads anywhere clinically useful remains uncertain, but the research is happening, funded by grant from institutions interested in any potential trauma treatment. Historians are reassessing witch trial records through the lens of ethnobotanical knowledge. How many of the confessions involved actual use of henbane and other psychoactive plants? How many described real hallucinogenic experiences reinterpreted through contemporary theological frameworks? The answers matter for understanding the witch hunts not as mass delusion, but as complex events where real pharmacology intersected with religious panic and social conflict. Henbane doesn't explain everything about the witch hunts, but it explains some things that previously seemed inexplicable. The story brings us full circle. 6,000 years ago, someone in the ancient Near East discovered that this plant could ease pain, induce visions, and at the wrong dose cause death. That discovery was passed forward, generation to generation, culture to culture, transformed by each society that encountered it. Greeks made it sacred to Apollo. Romans used it in military medicine. Vikings possibly weaponized it. Medieval Christians demonized it. Modern chemists abstracted it into pure compounds. And throughout all these transformations, the plant remained essentially unchanged, producing the same alkaloids in the same unpredictable concentrations, waiting for humans to figure out what to do with it. Today, if you know where to look, you can still find henbane growing wild in waste places, along roadsides, in disturbed ground. The sticky leaves with their covering of glandular hairs. The pale yellow flowers with purple veins. The fetid smell that gives it names like stinking nightshade. It looks unremarkable, a weedy plant that most people walk past without noticing. But in those tissues are compounds that have shaped human history as profoundly as iron or wheat or oil. Compounds that let ancient surgeons perform operations, that gave priestesses visions, that may have turned ordinary warriors into berserkers, that condemned women to torture and death, that now help millions manage pain and nausea and spasms. The fundamental relationship hasn't changed. Humans remain dependent on the chemical tools that plants provide. We've learned to synthesize some of them, to modify others, to understand their mechanisms at the molecular level. But we're still using henbane's legacy every day in hospitals and pharmacies across the world, still grappling with the same questions of dose and safety and appropriate use that confronted Egyptian physicians 3.5 millennia ago. The technology has advanced, the understanding has deepened, but the basic reality remains. We're biological organisms trying to manipulate our own neurology using chemicals borrowed from other species. Sometimes it works brilliantly. Sometimes it goes catastrophically wrong. And the margin between those outcomes is measured in milligrams, in knowledge, in respect for the power we're attempting to harness. That hasn't changed in 6,000 years, and it probably never will.